Ladies and gentlemen, so good to be back with you on the Ben Stewart Podcast. I am live in Austin right now, and this is going to be a really interesting podcast. Today, we have Greg Schmaus. He is the CEO of Healing 4D, a holistic health practitioner, a shamanic energy healer, and massage therapist. He's the creator of the Healing the Mind, a 21-day holistic mental health program. With fully integrated approach to physical and mental health, Greg supports students across the world in gaining understandings and the meaning to their healing journey, which is really important, the meaning of our healing journey. We're going to talk about that. Through his online programs and personal client coaching, Greg guides students and clients towards higher awareness, empowerment, and freedom in their lives through authentic lifestyle practices. This couldn't be needed more in the day we're living in today. So let's just hop right to it on the Ben Stewart Podcast. We are back. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us today.
Oh man, I'm so excited to be here. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, so it's really an honor for me to be here with you.
Right on. Well, first I got to say Gordo's over here pressing buttons. What's up, Gordo?
Hey guys, welcome to be here.
Yeah, man. Greg, I want to know, how was it that you found out about me then?
So, during my own healing journey, which we'll get into, my coach and mentor was a mutual friend of ours, Paul Chek. And Paul introduced me to a lot of your films and some of your work. I remember a couple of years ago watching the Psychedelica series and getting into a lot of your films. So I've been, a big fan for a while. So Paul introduced me to a lot of your work, and obviously our values and mission are very aligned. So it was important for me to reach out and connect. So I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, man. And I personally have to say that I think out of any other name that consistently comes up on this podcast, more than even political figures or famous elite, whatever, is Paul Chek. Paul Chek seems to be, that name is dropped in such a honored and prestigious way on this show. So Paul, love you so much. Thank you for the endless connections. Yeah, man. Cool, man. So, there's so many things I want to hop into. But that part that I stopped us on in the intro, where it says Greg supports students across the world in gaining an understanding and meaning to their healing journey. What is the importance of the meaning? Because most of us think healing is just like not to be sick anymore. Where does meaning come in when you have a client? Where does that element fall into the coaching process?
Well, the meaning gives us a sense of purpose. And the meaning really allows us to understand that there's usually a message behind a lot of our healing. And when we're engaging in the healing process and we're going through, the healing journey, we understand that we actually attract a lot of these challenges into our life as a means of growing us mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And whether it's the body, emotions, the mind, a lot of what we experience as symptoms are actually the feedback mechanism that's mirroring back to us our behaviors, choices, and belief systems that are either serving us or not serving us anymore. So it really gives us an opportunity to take a look at what's serving us and what's not serving us, so we can really dive into our healing journey and really access our highest potential and our highest self. So to me, the meaning of our healing journey is really giving us an opportunity to grow. And it's usually the challenging times in our life that really instill an opportunity for us to grow ourselves, where if everything's going smoothly and we're healthy and we're vital and there's no challenges throwing our way, there's not really much incentive for us to grow very much. So to me, the symptoms are really opportunities for us to take a deeper dive into ourselves.
Dude, profound. And I totally agree. Actually, one thing that I've been feeling so much about the world that we're living in today. I know a lot of people, they're constantly using the word crisis. And I love that people who are in the know understand that crisis is opportunity, and that ill health or accidents, whatever they may be, if they are things that we would term negative or bad, it is usually because we have a preference on how things should go in our life or what life is about. You know, a lot of times I think people feel like something's going wrong if you're going through a difficult period. And they're learning experiences, because at the end of the day, we're not here to get through life without any scratches. I think we're here to expand our consciousness and be a shining example for others on that path. I would love to know, you know, if there's any not specific examples, because I don't want you giving up people's, you know, goods and their details, but like, what have you come across that have been some of the more inspiring developments that have come out of teaching people that some of these things that they would say, like, you know, come on, Greg, help me with my back pain. I want to be rid of it. Or come on, man, I have this chronic blah, blah, blah. I want to be rid of it. I hate it. Just get rid of it for me, doc. You know, that whole mentality. How do you approach, maybe give a common example and show us how you would approach it?
Well, I'll give you an example that was just about 15 minutes ago with my last client for the day. My last client came in and he's been struggling with a lot of cardiovascular symptoms and a lot of high cortisol levels and a lot of vascular issues. And we were talking about where there's a lot of unnecessary stress in our life. And there's stress that's inevitable, but there's also unnecessary stress in terms of how we react to certain situations in our life, or how we engage certain relationships, or whatever it might be, how we engage our work and our coworkers in either a healthy or an unhealthy way. And what I was talking to him about, I said, listen, if your dream is to improve your cardiovascular health and high cortisol levels really are what cause a lot of the symptoms that you're experiencing, well, your high cortisol levels come from the way in which you're engaging your life, come from the way in which you're engaging your coworkers, the way in which you react to things rather than respond to things. So every area of your life literally has input and affects the outcome of what you're experiencing in your cardiovascular health. So the high cholesterol levels or the high cortisol levels, it's actually an invitation for you to take a deeper look into what you're creating in your own life, in your own relationships. And to me, that's one of the best definitions of spirituality, is really taking responsibility for what you create in your life on a moment-to-moment basis. So that's one example, is really just allowing the symptom on a medical level to be an opportunity and a gateway to take a look at where we need to take more responsibility for how we're engaging life on more of a collective level, whether it's in relationships, work, etc., finances, things like that. And to really kind of clean up the low-hanging fruit and where a lot of the unnecessary stress that we're actually creating is coming from. Another example is, which this is kind of a little bit more collectively, a lot of the clients that I work with, I kind of specialize in mental emotional health. And not that you can separate the physical, mental, emotional, it's obviously all, you know, one working system. But a lot of the clients that I work with, once they go through their healing process, they then usually become coaches or check practitioners. And what I realized is, on a spiritual level, one of my beliefs is that each one of our souls chooses a certain path. And a lot of the healers and coaches and therapists actually go through their own healing process, almost like an initiation. Like when I was working with Paul, and Paul was my coach and mentor, he said, Greg, this is not your therapy, this is your internship. And what he was saying is, you're going to be taking all of the tools that you're using in your own healing and sharing them with a lot of the people that you're going to be working with professionally. And I not only saw that in my own life with my own journey, but a lot of the clients that I work with that then go on to work with a lot of clients as a coach themselves, which gives me more of a sense of purpose, knowing that my work has more of a rippling effect than I can imagine.
That center of gravity, when you've experienced the low of some kind of, could be an ailment, could be a mindset, many things, but some kind of a low. And I've heard this from Paul before, because there was one example he said in one of his solo casts where he was like, I've had people who are still slightly overweight, even though they've dramatically changed their health, they're still slightly overweight. And maybe it was just one of them that was giving the example, like, who would listen to me if I tried to become a coach? I haven't even perfectly mastered my own health. And he was like, listen, me as Paul Chek, I am relatable to some people, but I'm not relatable to other people, because some people feel like they're at the bottom and I'm at the top, and they would just be like, come on, Paul, not everyone can be and look and, you know, live like you. So he was telling this client, he was like, you have made incredible progress, and there are people who need to hear it from you because they haven't made any progress and they can relate to you more. And don't get down on yourself about where you're at. Understand that you can leverage all these things that you're afraid of. And so Paul just has a brilliant mind, and I can tell, like, you know, it's not just that he rubbed off on you. I can tell that you've been predisposed towards this kind of thinking. I would love to go back in time a little bit and tell the audience, like, maybe what was it that set you off in the trajectory? What were some of the catalysts that set you on the trajectory of not just being like, well, I want to be healthy because you're a shamanic energy healer? Like, why did that come into the picture as well?
Well, just as it does for many shamans and many healers and many coaches, like I was saying, it usually starts with your own healing. And my own healing, I would say my own healing journey, obviously, it's hard to say when it started, but for me, the catalyst was during my freshman year of college, where I was on a Division I golf scholarship at the University of Houston. And halfway through my freshman year, I experienced a testicular torsion where I had to go in for surgery. And as I was coming out of anesthesia, I started experiencing a lot of obsessive compulsive patterns, a lot of insomnia, a lot of anxiety, a lot of panic attacks. And I had never experienced any of these symptoms before. So it was a real shocker to me. I felt like my life literally changed in a moment's notice. And my life went from pursuing a professional golf career to simply just trying to get my head above water. So that really kind of brought me in a new direction. And my life was like, okay, well, you know, I'm no longer focused on my golf career. I'm focused on really healing myself. And to me, I honestly think it was one of the greatest gifts I ever received, because it really delivered me to my life path and my life purpose. And it took many, many years for me to heal from a lot of that. And I mean, I'm still on my healing journey. We all are. But it really gave me an opportunity to do the work inside of myself that I was then going to do with a lot of my clients. So I was definitely coming from a place of authenticity, not from a place of, well, I've studied this in a course or I read this in a textbook somewhere. So recently I was filming my first online program, Healing the Mind. And what really was validation for me about my own journey was when I filmed that course, I didn't have to do any research. I didn't have to cite any sources. I didn't have to study anything. It was just really, I'm going to share what I experienced on my own journey, what I know works, what I've put into practice with a lot of my clients. And when I built that course, I knew that everything that I share and teach is coming from a place of authentic experience, not just kind of like the kind of intellectual mind, so to speak. So it's more, for me, my journey is about more embodied wisdom in whatever you're teaching and sharing, making sure you're living that. And I think that's also why we're drawn to people like Paul Chek, is Paul's a living example of everything that he teaches, everything that he shares. So I think we're really drawn to that authenticity.
So the shamanic energy healing, I want to understand this a little bit more, especially the way of titling it as such. What kind of work is this? What would be a typical client that comes to you for that kind of work?
So a typical client can be anything. I mean, I have clients that come to me with physical pain, with mental, emotional challenges, with things like sexual trauma, all kinds of stuff. And the shamanic energy work, obviously I've done a lot of shamanic healing work with Paul, but I did formal training with a shaman, Alberto Violdo, who has a school and a training program called the Four Winds.
That's Chile, right?
Yeah, he's in Chile.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I did 6 months of intense training with him and his instructors. And that work really, has a wide variety of applications. So it's, doing a lot of hands-on energy work and working with the chakra system and the energy field and doing illuminations and extractions and doing soul retrievals and, a lot of the real deep shamanic work on a more energetic level. And for me, that was really the next step in my the evolution of my work, which really started very much on the physical level, like it does for most Czech practitioners. But then you realize, wow, well, the physical is really an expression of the mental and the emotional. So you start diving into more mental, emotional therapy and coaching. But then you get to the point where you're like, well, the mental and the emotional is being informed by the energy fields. So the energy field is really the field of energy and information that informs the mind, informs the emotions, and then informs matter how to arrange itself in physical form. So if you're working on the mental, emotional, and physical level, but not addressing what's happening on the energetic level, where there's a lot of unresolved trauma, there's a lot of energetic imprints that are informing the mind, the emotions, and the body, then it's still kind of just palliative care. You're not really getting to the root cause of it. So that's where the shamanic energy work of really working with the energetic field of a being, not just the mind, the emotions, and the body, has been a real game changer for me.
I'm really curious about just like the whole research of past life regressions and dealing with basically dealing with karmic trauma relief, essentially. Like a lot of this idea of, you know, if you believe in the idea that this is not your first life and you've had many lives, I've looked at somebody I watched a lot of her videos was Alba Weinman, and I know there's a lot of different modalities from QHHT to Brian Weissman and different people who specialize in different techniques for it. But bottom line for me is I definitely think that is very real and part of what's going on. You know, holistically, it's this life is important, and obviously be here now is very critical, but we are the culmination of, you know, hundreds, maybe thousands, you know, many, many lives possibly before this. And I've researched this a lot. I first got into it because I was looking at, you know, prodigies and young children and this idea of how do certain kids naturally have such talents for piano or these type of things, as well as traumas that would carry over, like fear and phobias from, you know, fear of water, or if you're in a past life and you've been killed in battle, hearing people actually release these traumas, going to the moment of them leaving the body and then bringing closure essentially to that was really, really powerful for me and kind of a big game changer on how I just sort of view everything. This life, it's a culmination, really. This is very much a journey. And I'm curious, you know, you just kind of touched on that, but this idea of, what are your thoughts on essentially sort of this idea of past lives, its connection to the current life, and also, this is a little bit more heady, but, you know, we'll just go there. But this idea of, I've also seen like entity removal and this idea of actual other dimensional beings somehow being connected to us karmically or energetically. I'm curious your thoughts on that and your experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few perspectives and experiences with that. I mean, one thing that I'm blessed with is the ability to see a lot of that. So when I do soul retrievals or I'm, you know, working shamanically, I can see other entities. I can see aspects of the soul that are fragmented, and whether that's in this lifetime or not, sometimes you're not really that clear, but it also doesn't really matter in terms of the work that you're going to do anyway. So when it comes to past lives, there's kind of like two elements that I kind of take a look at. Number one, is it a past life, or two, is it more ancestral related? So when it's a past life, it's more related to the soul. When it's more ancestral, it's more, say, generational trauma that's been passed down in the cellular memory, so to speak. So for example, if you take ancestral trauma or generational trauma, an example would be like, let's say, Holocaust survivors that then have children and grandchildren. And let's say the child or the grandchild or the great-grandchild starts having maybe like social anxiety or a fear of being in public places, or whatever that might be. And you ask the child, like, I don't know where this came from. Like, this doesn't even feel like it's mine. Well, what's important to understand is, from an ancestral generational standpoint, that pattern of, say, staying away from large crowds was actually a survival adaptation. Because when that original generation was in large crowds, they may have been kind of like picked out by the crowd and put in a concentration camp or something, or they may have been found. So there's kind of like this need to hide and stay away from large crowds. So passed down in the cellular memory is what was needed to adapt and survive in previous generations. And it was important for that generation to pass down that cellular memory and imprint down into the next generation. And I think there's research that shows it goes 7 generations. So a lot of what's generational and ancestral is more a survival adaptation, but then shows up as a pathology, because obviously in this lifetime, we don't need that survival adaptation because we're not in a Holocaust. Right. But on a cellular level, the body and the nervous system doesn't actually know that, right? It's still it's still experiencing the present through the lens of the past. So that's one thing that's really important, is to differentiate, is this ancestral and generational on a cellular level, or is this more the journey of the soul? So when it's the journey of the soul, something that I feel like is really important, which Ben, your first question is, how do we find meaning to our healing journey, is one thing that I truly believe is each soul incarnates with certain lessons to learn. Each soul incarnates with certain work to do, and each soul incarnates into certain families as a means of doing some of the healing work to clear a certain pattern from a lineage, to clear a certain pattern from the collective. And a lot of the soul's journey obviously is many, many lifetimes, but it's a continuation of that work. So for me, when I'm working with a client and we're exploring past lives or generational trauma, it really gives that client a sense of purpose in doing the work, because they feel like it's actually contributing to the greater whole. So that's something that I feel like is really important in past lifetimes. And when it comes to working with entities, there's a couple of elements there. Is number one, a lot of times what we perceive as an entity is just an element of the ego or the psyche that's become so fragmented, and we've become so divorced from certain parts of ourselves and so disassociated that it appears to be a separate entity. So a lot of people come in and say, I think I have an entity possession, but what they're not realizing is it's a part of themselves that they're so divorced from that it appears to be a separate being. And a lot of times that's not an entity extraction that you have to do. That's a soul retrieval that you have to do. So the soul retrieval is kind of like this person is a puzzle, and all the pieces are so fragmented and broken off that the soul retrieval is like taking one piece at a time and putting it back into the puzzle. So now you have the completed puzzle. And that's very different than, it's basically the exact opposite of doing an entity extraction where you're pulling out rather than putting back in. So it really takes, a skilled practitioner to kind of decipher the difference and understand when it is an entity possession or when it is more of an ego fragmentation. And another element is whether it is an entity possession or not, what's more important than removing the entity is addressing that person's susceptibility to the entity possession. Right. And the susceptibility to an entity possession is really almost like, if you imagine you have your house or your home that you live in, and if someone's never home and they're always leaving the door unlocked, you're way more susceptible to a robber to break in and basically inhabit the empty house. Right. So someone who's susceptible to entity possessions is not fully inhabiting themselves. They're not fully taking care of themselves. They're not really in their power. They're not setting healthy boundaries, and they're too permeable. They're too absorbent. And so that's really what's more important than removing the entity, is really addressing what that person's affinity to an entity is, which is really leaving the house door unlocked too much.
Right. Makes sense.
This Saturday, I'm here in Austin. We're going to be doing a community summit, and it's called the Activation Summit. It's all about what does community look like moving forward. And rather than having to take, as Marshall McLuhan says, we drive into the future using only our rear view mirrors. And that doesn't, for the most part, that doesn't cause for very good decisions moving forward. So what does community look like moving forward in the world that we actually are in today? And also, what have we learned from the past? So what is the ethos of a community? And then getting into all the, the brass tacks about like how to make sure that people are actually in a proper agreement and they understand the agreement. And then also that there's enough communication so that the community members can all mirror one another, respecting boundaries, listening for boundaries, and communicating boundaries really well. And because you mentioned that, I would love to hear your thoughts. Like, let's say I know maybe this isn't your expertise, but just to say, if, let's say you had a group of people come to you for your thoughts on how to enter into an agreement as a community to honor and respect boundaries, to make sure that we're even communicating enough, and to actually have a proper agreement. And not getting into contracts, I'm talking about individuals. So you mentioned that part of the work that you do is somebody might have sexual trauma. Does any of what you work on more than just one person? And if so, what would be your advice to people who are looking to enter into, intentional community is a newer phrase, but it's this idea of community rather than just being one citizen in a city full of millions of people that your only connection is your close proximity. Most people, your neighbors, it's not a community. You barely talk to one another. So I guess if that made enough sense for you, like what would be some tips for people to make sure that they're standing in their power, they're communicating their boundaries, and they're helping hold other people accountable to their highest potential, and also listening well when receiving feedback, when somebody is calling us to step into our own higher potential? What are your thoughts on that?
So a couple things come up is, number one, I love Paul's system when it comes to relationships of the I, the we, and the all. So the I is your relationship with yourself. The we is your relationship with one other. And the all is the relationship with two or more, or a group, or the collective, or a community, like you're sharing. So I think where we get into trouble in relationships and community is where we skip the steps. We skip I and go to we, or we skip I and we go to the all. And when we skip I and go to we, for example, we create a lot of relationships of codependency, a lack of boundaries, insecure attachment styles, things like that. So for me, the I relationship is your relationship with yourself, and really understanding that you're the only one that's truly responsible for offering yourself the love and connection that you need. And then if we skip that, we become dependent on other people to feed us the nutrition of love and connection. So that's where we create a lot of codependency. So for me, I is, what do I need to offer myself to fill my cup up first before I offer myself to one other or the collective? And to me, that's, what are my needs? What are my values? And how committed am I to living in full alignment with my needs and my values before I step into partnership with one other or a group? Then you step into a we relationship, which is two I's coming together. And the two I's coming together, or you have the I here and the I here, which, one person has their needs and values, the other person has their needs and values. And then the we is almost like a third being, where we have shared needs and shared values. And that's where we come into partnership, where we honor the I first, and then we share what we have to offer in the we. And then we take that to the next level of the all. And the all is really, for me, what's my contribution as an I, and in relationship in a we, what's my contribution to the greater whole? And that's, for me, where having a sense of purpose is really important. And the prerequisite to a healthy all relationship is to make sure that you've got the I and the we dialed in terms of your needs, your values, and how you live in full alignment with your truth. Another thing that comes up for me is nonviolent communication. To me, nonviolent communication is so important. And I love the way Marshall Rosenberg lays all of that out. I love the 4 steps of observe, feel, need, request. And I think if people got the nonviolent communication down, that would, heal so much trauma and so much pain and stress in relationships and in community and in families. So, a couple things that come up for me there. Number one, really being connected to what you need, really being connected to how you feel. And what you need is based on how you feel. And the first step is really the mindful awareness, the observation. That's why step 1 is observe, or observation. And I love how Marshall Rosenberg says, observe without evaluating. And that's a big thing for me is, are you in observation mode or are you in interpretation mode? And that's not just of yourself, but when you're engaging other people, when you're listening to them and you're receiving them and holding space for them, are you observing what they're saying, or are you already coming up with your own interpretation of what they're saying? So that's a big thing for me, is the nonviolent communication, and not just being able to connect with how you feel and what you need and requesting that, but also having open curiosity to someone else and what they might need. For example, if someone in the community engages you in a way that's stressful, maybe they're under stress and they're constantly, throwing jabs at you, or you feel like you're under attack. One thing that I love from the nonviolent communication is asking the person, hey, I notice you feeling a little upset or a little overwhelmed or a little stressed. Is there something that you need right now that would be supportive for you? And what that does is that immediately sets a boundary, because that puts a mirror up for them. As soon as you ask them the question, is there something that you need right now that I can support you in? It creates a mirror that they have to look into themselves. So as previously they were projecting their own shadow or their own unconscious onto you, as soon as you inquire with them, is there something that you need, and you hold that mirror up for them, it redirects their attention inward. So to me, making sure the needs and the values are dialed in the I, then the we, and then ultimately the all, and really dialing in the nonviolent communication of observing without evaluating, observing without interpreting, then tuning into how you feel. What you need is based on how you feel. So you tune into how you're feeling, what you're needing, and then you can make the request. And then inquiring when someone else is feeling a certain way, hey, is there something that you need right now I can support you in? So those are some of the elements that I feel that come up for me when it comes to that question of what we can really embody. The last thing that just kind of popped in was, especially right now with the state of the world and the current pandemic, this is huge with people's belief systems and how everything's so divided and polarized, is understanding how the ego and the nervous system work. One thing that's really important to understand is when someone's in a fight or flight state, when someone's in a stress response, they're essentially in survival mode. When someone's in survival mode, it shifts them into what's called the default mode network, which is basically the part of the brain that says, do what you've always done, think what you've always thought, believe what you've always believed, because it's kept you alive until now. And anything new, novel, or different is a threat to your survival because it's the unknown. So the more stress someone is under in the community, the more narrow the bandwidth for them to integrate any new idea that you might have to offer. So a mantra of mine that has been very helpful for me recently, whenever I've been engaging my family or anyone that might have, different ideas about vaccinations or the pandemic or whatever it might be, is tune into where you feel like their nervous system is at. And you can pick that up pretty darn quickly. And say, okay, if they're in a stress response, their bandwidth to integrate any of my new ideas is going to be completely shut down. One of my favorite sayings that Paul says is, when you're running from a lion, it's not a good idea to throw in a cartwheel. And what he was really saying is, when you're under stress and you're in survival mode, anything that's new, novel, or creative is a threat to your survival.
That's true.
So the bandwidth for them to integrate anything is shut down. So a mantra for me has been, don't change their mind, shift their state. And when you can shift them back into a parasympathetic state, you start to open the bandwidth, and then you can introduce a new idea and plant a new seed, and they can actually bring it into their system because they're not in survival mode. So that's been a big thing for me, is really understanding how the ego, the nervous system, and someone's bandwidth actually works.
So you're saying to slip them a psychedelic without their understanding, so they go into a different state of consciousness, then you can, no, I know that's not what you're saying. The reason why I started like that is because also Marshall Rosenberg says in nonviolent communication, when somebody says something and you notice you have a reaction to it, asking them if you heard them clearly, so repeating back what you heard them say, and then so what I'm hearing, or what I heard you say is yada yada, and am I right in feeling that this is the way you're feeling right now? And so it causes for them to further reflect and refine what they said, because we know a lot of people, when they're just in the default mode network, it could be like a cab driver or something who says something really offensive or whatever it might be. It could just be their way of like breaking up tension, or they don't realize that they could be abrasive to somebody. And then when you, instead of being like, yo, dude, that was completely uncalled for, you could say, like, hey, I want to understand what you just said better. And it causes for them to at least analyze their own words and what came out of their own mouth as well. I wanna switch gears because in the chat, Francis Ignatius said, do you think entities within people that aren't, or have you found entities within people that aren't aware that they are attached to something, to somebody else? I'm trying to read the way it was written, that aren't aware they have anything attached to them or going on. Oh, okay. So I guess, do you find that people with entities aren't aware that anything is going on? I actually thought that question was coming from the entity itself, but so let me just read it one more time just to make sure. Yeah. So do you feel entities within people that aren't aware they have anything attached to them or going on? I'm sorry, Francis.
That they have an entity, is that what's being asked?
I think that's what he's,
I guess and then the second question to that, maybe you could just lump them together, is can a positive entity be just as detrimental to a person as a negative one? Maybe just let me know your thoughts on what you hear in that question.
Well, most people who have entities that are really affecting their life in a negative way are not aware of it. And usually the reason that we have entities is we leave the back door open in some way and we're unconscious in some certain way. So we're usually quite unconscious of what's going on. But, you know, like I said earlier, the most important thing is what's that person's affinity to it. So they're usually not aware of it, but sometimes they have some confusion, like, I started doing this, or I started, you know, experiencing this new behavior pattern or this new affinity to alcohol or sugar or whatever it might be. And I've never experienced that before. So sometimes there's like a radical shift in kind of behavior patterns or thought patterns. So that's one way in which you can start to become aware of, okay, maybe there's something going on here, but most people are not aware that they have some sort of entity possession. The second question was, could a positive entity have some sort of negative effect? Is that?
I guess like, yeah, like could it hinder, could you become too reliant on it, or could it hinder you?
Okay, yeah.
Is there a positive entity that would actually enter someone?
Yes. So, I mean, you know, I work with spirit guides, so I consider those to be positive entities. But, you know, spirit guides and entities of a higher vibration always have what's in the best interest of you.
Right.
But here's where, you know, that question can get interesting, and you can actually engage it in a negative way is, and I've experienced this in my own life. I've, you know, had conversations with my guides, and a lot of times I'll ask the question, you know, why don't I feel as clear of a message in terms of your guidance and in terms of what you're calling me to do or say or whatever it might be? And the answer that rises up is always, well, it's time for you to shift out of the child archetype that's always dependent on someone else to make a choice for you. So a lot of times when we have positive entities or spirit guides or whatever it might be, we can overly rely on them to make choices for us, just like we're kind of like projecting the mother and father archetype onto a positive entity, and it keeps you in the position of a disempowered child. So that's where I would answer that question of how something positive can turn negative, is you don't really learn how to embody and take full responsibility for your choices. You're still outsourcing it to some external source, and that's how it can be used in a negative way, where it's just keeping yourself trapped in the child archetype.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I had a question about when you, something that I've come across, and I think we've all probably experienced being involved in the conscious media space, is this kind of illusory trap of the spiritual ego occurring.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on when you come across somebody who, you know, has good intentions, but you see the ego being manifested through a spiritual lens versus maybe, you know, somebody who just has the classic narcissist ego kind of thing?
Well, the spiritual ego for me is just, it's a form of bypassing, and you can pick it up very quickly. And, you know, I think I've struggled with it myself. And the spiritual ego, I would say one area that it comes up for me a lot is a big word that's been on my mind recently, and I was actually sharing this in a newsletter recently, is the word deserving. And how I feel like the word deserving is one of the most dangerous words that we can have and use. And I think the spiritual ego falls into this trap a lot where, and this starts from a very young age, where programs like as a child, if you do something good, you deserve a reward. If you do something bad, you deserve a punishment. So a lot of times when the ego feels like it did something good or it did something spiritual, it should receive a reward from the universe.
Where's my cookie?
Where's my spiritual cookie, so to speak? And then if we do something bad, there's a lot of times the ego feels like it deserves a punishment. But what kind of starts to unravel the spiritual ego is when we do something good and we don't get a reward that we were looking for, or we feel like we didn't do anything wrong or we didn't do anything bad, and we feel like we experienced something that we didn't want. So what happens is we have this polarity of, on one end, we have this sense of entitlement of, if I do something good, I'm entitled to something good. And if I didn't do something wrong, then I'm not deserving of something wrong or something bad. So it creates victimhood. Right. So to me, the word deserving creates entitlement on one polarity and victimhood on the other polarity. And the spiritual ego kind of falls into that trap of, if I do something good, I deserve a reward. I'm entitled to that. If I do something wrong, I deserve a punishment. But if I didn't do something wrong, why are these things happening to me? Why is there crisis? Why is there chaos? But the spiritual ego doesn't understand that it doesn't work that way. The spiritual ego tries to build its spiritual kind of, it tries to build itself up as a way of protecting itself from any future pain or harm. So it's really a way of trying to bypass any challenges, any pain, any obstacles, anything that might be threatening or inconvenience. I think a big thing with the spiritual ego is it tries to protect itself from any inconvenience. And it uses spirituality as a way of doing that. And a lot of it is really just bypassing our own authenticity, and that's, something that I think is really important that Paul talks a lot about is called the story gap. And the story gap is big when it comes to the spiritual ego. And we see this a lot in the conscious community. The story gap is the difference between the story you tell yourself and the story you tell the world. And the greater the gap, or the bigger the difference, the more you open the door for things like fatigue and illness and disease. And the reason for that is, when you have a story gap and you have an internal story and an external story that don't match, you have to invest energy into two stories. So you're dividing your energy in half. And it's kind of like if your life was a film, you have to play two roles instead of one, which consumes twice the amount of energy. So a big thing with the spiritual ego is that story gap. So a big thing for me in real spirituality is aligning the story gap. So we have what's called authenticity, where your inner story and your outer story match. So I think that's something that's really important, is for people to understand the story gap.
I also feel that there's, getting to what you were saying about the spiritual, the ego bypassing. A lot of the times, I think this is just another way to say what you're saying, but people feel like unpleasantness, uncomfortability, pain, suffering, that these things aren't good, that they serve no purpose, that we shouldn't have them, that they aren't lessons and teachers that come about. And another thing is thinking that we have a solid grasp on why things happen. So this happened to me, but it shouldn't have. Well, you have, without truly investigating, you're not listening. You're saying, well, I already know, and this is wrong. What I got from life is wrong because I already know what I deserve. And that gets back to the deserving part. But it is this lack of humility of, what was that? It was a proverb from, ancient China, where there was a guy who, the emperor sent scouts around to gather up all the, worthy men for battle. And they came to town. And they told this man, like, okay, you're too old, you can't go to battle. And everyone was like, oh, you're so lucky. And he was like, we'll see. And then they came back and they were like, oh, sir, your son is actually old enough for battle. And they're like, oh, you're so unlucky. And he says, oh, we'll see. And I forget the very next part of it, but his son goes off and meets the woman of dreams, and like survives battle, meets the woman of his dreams, and everyone's like, oh, you're so lucky, and he was like, we'll see. And then it just kept going on, and this like everyone around him thinks like, oh, that's good fortune, or oh man, that's such bad fortune. He's just like, to me, this is life. Keep listening, stop pretending like and maybe you won't have this incongruence between what you think you deserve and what you're getting out of life. And if you're getting things that seem a little bit, uncomfortable, why are you looking at it like a punishment from God rather than a lesson from God, something that can expand your consciousness? And as you say, your soul is here to learn certain lessons rather than, oh, I'm being punished because I didn't do the right thing. Have you found that there are clients that are stuck in that victimhood, that like, look at what's happening to me and look at what other people are getting? And if you've had people who are stuck in that, what are some of the like sexy, seductive reasons why people don't move forward from that, even when because I have people, not super close, but I have people in my life who consistently come to me, and I can sense that aspect of what they're saying. And when I offer advice, then they know better. At that point, they know better when they get the advice. And I'm like, okay, so you don't want to hear from me? And, so I would love to hear it from somebody who takes on a lot of clients, such as yourself, in these spaces. How would you approach somebody who on the face of it, they want to know how to move past the suffering? And then once you lay out, well, I think it's a lot about the way you're framing it, and it's the choices that you're making based upon that framing. And then they're like, nah, I'm good. Can you tell me something else?
That's inconvenient.
Yeah. That's inconvenient.
It's going to take work, bro.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Wow. The archetypes are really powerful to explore, and it's, work that I do a lot in my coaching practice. And we have those 4 survival archetypes of the victim, saboteur, the child, and the prostitute. And the victim and the survival archetypes are really, at the most foundational level, they're our relationship with power. And really, the victim is the part of us that feels powerless, but paradoxically, we use the victim archetype in a bit of a manipulative way. And we actually, paradoxically, use the experience of powerlessness as a way of trying to gain power. So we use playing the victim as a way of feeling power over people. Also, the victim archetype, remember, the victim's always looking for a rescuer. So the victim's always looking to be rescued. And a lot of times, handing the victim tools for them to empower themselves is actually very threatening to their own internal agenda. So a lot of times we use health problems, we use crisis, we use pain as a way of getting some sort of need met. And I've had a ton of clients that have come in, and when you hear them speak about wanting to heal, what I actually hear them say is, I'm actually getting my needs met by being in pain, so I'm not really willing to do the work because I actually don't want to heal. For example, let's say you have a client that comes to you with chronic back pain, and they've had paid time off work for them to go get therapy and to go get PT and to go get body work and to come do coaching. And let's say they hate their job, they don't enjoy their coworkers, and they're not really happy in their relationships, so they're not really getting any love and connection from their relationships. But when they play the victim and they stay in pain and they come to the therapists and the practitioners like myself, we are really the only source of love and connection that they have in their life. So getting out of pain means they have to go back to the job that they hate, the coworkers that they don't enjoy, and they would have no need to continue coming to the therapists or the coaches that are really the only source of love and connection and the only place where they feel safe being authentically themselves. So there's a lot of reasons why we play the victim to, one, try and attract a rescuer to come save us so we can actually feel seen and valued and heard. And other ways in which we play the victim, I'll give you an example from my own life, and I'll be really open and transparent and vulnerable, is, I didn't have a real close relationship with my dad on a deep emotional level when I was growing up. And my dad was an orthopedic physician. So anytime I was hurt or I was injured or I was in pain, my mom would take me to my dad's office, and I was the doctor's son. So I got all the best treatment. I got all the attention from my dad and his nurses and everything. So I felt so much more love and connection with my father when I was in pain. So I would actually use pain as a way of trying to get my emotional needs met. Mm-hmm. Another example might be a child, maybe both their parents work full-time jobs, so they never really get a lot of attention. But when they're sick and they have to stay home from school, one of the parents stays home with them and stays in bed with them and, makes soup for them. And they feel so much more nourished and taken care of when they're sick. So we actually use a lot of self-sabotage behavior as a way of playing the victim to look for some rescuer to take care of us in order for us to get our emotional needs met. And that's how we use powerlessness as a form of power. So, that's really, I mean, you can take a very deep dive into the victim archetype. Those are just a few examples of how we kind of manipulate our relationship with power and play the victim in kind of getting those needs met.
Super deep, man. I love that. And I love your responses, man. I really do appreciate it. In the chat, I also wanted to mention, Francis, I think we could package this. Francis Ignatius said, Mary Jane helps me being patient and not overreacting, and has brought, me this conversation about questioning things my whole life, but I also think I got to cut back. Any suggestions? I'll loop that in with something that Michael Garcia says, which is, I would like to know how many of your clients are addicts or alcoholics. And it says, this is a big thing in my life and of people that I know. So I guess the question there isn't just how many of them are addicts or alcoholics, but like, how do you approach addiction? You just kind of mentioned addiction to that archetype of gaining power through these manipulative means, but by self-medicating and drugging ourselves out, how do you go deeper than, let's say, AA? You're always an addict, you're always in recovery. How do you go to the mental, emotional, maybe even a little bit deeper into that energetic field?
Yeah. A couple of things is, number one, all addictions are really an attempt at safe love. And a lot of times we use an addiction as a way of connecting to something that feels safe. And one thing that we would want to take a look at is, well, what are some of the relationships? What are some of the earliest memories in which you didn't feel safe? And how are we using the connection to an addiction as a way of disconnecting from those parts of ourselves? So that's first and foremost, is how are we connecting to something that feels safe as a way of disconnecting from a part of ourselves that feels unsafe? That's one element. Number two, obviously we use a lot of our addictions, and a lot of them are very subtle. They're not very obvious. Some people have exercise addictions. Some people have addictions to information, whatever it might be. So one big thing is, what on an emotional level are we bypassing, and what parts of ourselves are we unwilling to feel and experience? And that's some of the work that we have to go into. A couple other elements with the addiction is, when we have addiction, there's no boundaries. By definition, an addict has no boundaries with a person, a substance, an activity, or whatever it might be. And the boundaries are really where we maintain our sense of personal power. So a lot of addiction is where we give our power away. And a lot of times we have energy and power that we dump into the addiction. And a lot of people don't want to get rid of their addictions, because if they got rid of the addiction, they would actually reclaim all of the energy and the power, and they wouldn't know how to utilize it. That's why in Paul's teachings and at the Czech Institute, he says, when you have a big enough dream, you don't need a crisis. And what he's saying is, when you have a big enough dream and you reclaim the energy and the power that you were dumping into the addiction, you have a sense of purpose in how you're then going to reinvest that energy and reinvest that power. But if you don't know how you're going to utilize it, because you're not in a career that you enjoy, you're not in a relationship that you want to be in, what happens is we use an addiction as a way of sabotaging that energy and sabotaging that power, because we'd rather not have it than have it and not know how to utilize it. And a lot of people that reclaim the energy and the power and they don't know how to utilize it, all of a sudden they experience anxiety.
Mania.
And the anxiety and mania is really, I'm actually reclaiming my sovereignty, my energy, and my power, but it's actually stressful because I don't know how to channel and utilize it. So that's where having a lot of our creative outlets is so important, and having a sense of purpose is when you reclaim the energy and the power from getting rid of the addiction, then we can actually go and live our dream and live our purpose. But if we don't know what that is for us, and we don't know what that mission is, or what that meaning is for us, then we're going to sabotage it every time. So a lot of the addiction is a way that we pacify ourselves and disconnect from the part of ourselves that knows that we're not living fully in alignment with our highest potential. So there's so many elements here in terms of addiction, but one thing I've really been exploring is how that happens on an energetic level. Is, you know, the energy we dump into the addiction and then how we reclaim it, but don't know how to reinvest it.
Dude, I love that. I love that. And I, you know, so you're mentioning, there's one other question I want to get to after this, but because it came to me when you said that when the dream is big enough, say that one part again. When the dream is big enough, what was the end? You don't need a crisis. Okay, so we are in a world where the word crisis is in every newspaper, every article. And I would love to also bring up the distinction, because I feel like there's a lot of people who are self-medicating and they do have a dream. They do have a dream. And I guess this is why you used when the dream is big enough, you don't need a crisis. Because I have a lot of people that they have wishes and they have these dreams, but they're not actively acting on it yet. Is that possibly because there's an internal obstacle, I don't deserve it, or if I even try, I'll never get it, or not having enough understanding, like, well, I know what the dream is, but where do I start? Like, I want to become I want to become a famous director, or I want to do this, that, and the other, but I have no idea what foot to put first and in what direction. So before I hop on to the next question, I want to know, like, I want to dig into when the dream is big enough. Could you give us a little more parameters to that?
Yeah, and it's less big as in size, like how grand it is, and more big enough as in how much it really means to you. A lot of people say, I want to lose 20 pounds. That's my dream. But it's like, you ask the question, well, why do you want to lose 20 pounds? Most of them don't have a legitimate answer. It's usually so they can look better in a bikini, which is really their desperate attempt for approval. So it's actually feeding into their addiction of, you know, self-validation, and their sense of self is still externalized because their sense of self is based on how they feel perceived by the outer world. So when you're assessing a dream, you have to ask the question, is this actually your dream that's coming from the inside? Or is this a dream that you've been told, or a dream that you've been kind of like conditioned to believe is right for you, or a dream that you adopted from the outer world? So that's where we have to really assess, is this, you know, an internal dream that you really want to pursue, or is this something that you're kind of utilizing as a way of distracting yourself from something that you're being called to do?
Do you ever come in contact with people who feel they have no dream? They don't even know where they would start. Like, I don't know what I want. I don't know how to connect with a bigger vision for me. What is there a common denominator there, or is it all over the place, or how do you work with such a thing?
Well, one of the ways that, you know, even in the Czech Institute, Paul teaches people to work with is, if you don't know what a dream is for a person, identify what their nightmare is. Because if you don't know what you want to move towards, at least know what you want to move away from, because at least there's movement.
Yeah.
Right? So if you can't identify the dream, identify the nightmare, so you can actually create movement. And as soon as you create movement and someone is moving away from what they don't want, they're actually unconsciously moving towards what they do want without even realizing it.
Mm-hmm. So good, because I've even seen this in other examples. Like, if you don't know where you're at or where you're going, if you just start making decisions and moving, you're going to start gathering more data. And maybe at that point, even if you were headed in the wrong direction, you'll quicker find out if you start moving in the wrong direction rather than staying still.
Yeah.
So I dig what you're saying there. There's one other question that came up. I think this is powerful and important because we're talking about archetypes. And Francis again says, how do you guys play the balancing act of knowing why things are happening? Because we're giving a bunch of like answers and verbal responses to common things that seem to come up in clients. How do we play the balancing act of knowing things and speaking about these things, and balance that with the famous saying, the only thing I know is that I know nothing at all? Like, how do we come from that place of knowing and still have that humility, I guess is the question.
Yeah. So for me, which I can only speak from my own experience, that's one of the ways in which I do it, is I only speak from my own experience. That's the only thing I can know for sure is my own experience. So that's number one, is always coming from a place of authenticity of I speak based on what I've experienced in my own life and on my own journey. And another element is when I'm working with clients, I very often, when I'm delivering a lot of the messages that, we're talking about today, I very often deliver them in a question format. And I, deliver it with, something like, consider this, or what if this. So I'm delivering it in a way that's very non-threatening, and I'm delivering it in a way which it's more of an open invitation to explore. It's not me projecting an idea onto you for you to take and believe like it's, the written word. So that's a couple of ways. Is number one, I always try and speak from my own life experience because that's all I know for sure. And then secondly, I always try and express it in either question format or open invitation. So that gives the other person on the receiving end an opportunity to take it in whatever direction they want to go in. And it feels less threatening to their ego because it's not me telling you the truth. It's me inviting you to consider a truth.
Yeah. I dig that. It's almost like Inception. The mind will reject an idea if it feels like it was planted there from the outside. But, still we do plant seeds in our fellow, brethren, sisterhood, all that. We do plant seeds. And it does seem that some of the best ways for those seeds to be planted, I've noticed that there are a lot of friends that they do not take advice. And I may also be one of those, right? I hate being told. I have a hard time working for other people because I know I know to a certain extent what my time is best spent serving. And I also know it deeply within me when I'm doing something that I'm like, this is not what my soul is asking me to do. But right now I'm going to do it because this seems like it's the task in front of me. So I also have some of these blocks, but as far as what I notice, the friends that I do have that are kind of in that space where like we all have ego, and when their ego comes out where it's like, no, I don't want advice. I don't want you to be my coach. We're friends. I notice that a lot of the times where it actually works is not when I'm actually trying to surreptitiously plant a seed. It's when I just try and resonate with where I feel a wound of theirs is. And I don't do it by pointing out theirs. I do it by finding a resonant frequency inside me. And I'll just tell them the story. But like, man, last week I was just not in the right character around my kids. I barely was looking anyone in my family in the eyes. I was totally in my head. And whenever they wanted to spend time around me, I had excuses. And then I'll notice that resonant frequency picked up in them, and they'll be like, oh man, dude, I feel the same exact way. And then they'll just give voice to their story as well. And then I don't have to say, well, I think you should do this then. I'm just like, yeah, man, well, brothers in arms, like, let's face this together and be better together, and it usually seems like that is what community wishes to be more of, not a bunch of, chiefs telling other people, how to Indian, but really, listening and doing what friends and real friends would do, which is if you have to get straight to the point and cut straight to the jugular, be like, bro, I think if I'm going to be honest, and I know this ain't a popular opinion, but I think this is what I'm sensing. And sometimes I've noticed that that's the only way, and I know I'm going to get pushed back, and I usually right afterwards put up my hands and be like, sorry if that was like uncalled for. I love you, and that's it. I would love to know, you have clients, but you also have a family, you have people close in your circle. How do you approach these situations differently when it's somebody who's like, yeah, but this isn't Greg Schmaus, the Shamanic Energy Healer. This is the dude I grew up with. Like, F you, dude. We grew up, doing blah, blah, blah. So how do you notice you reconcile the you that clients coming to you as somebody with an expertise, and other people that you see have the same kinds of problems but view you differently?
So that's something that's been, something I've had to really work on in my own life, because, I have a strong healer archetype, and the healer archetype, the light side is being of service to people in their healing. The shadow side is you're trying to fix everybody. And, there's what's called an archetypal possession, which is you shift into the archetype and play the role, but you don't know how to shift out of it. So early on in my career, I used to, be the coach or the healer in my practice, but then I wouldn't shift out of the role when I went home. And I would, try and show up in that role for all of my family members. And I just got met with so much resistance. I'm like, wow, okay, I got to take a look at myself here and see what's going on. And a couple of things that have been really helpful for me is I only share advice if someone asks. That's first and foremost, is I wait until they ask for advice. But if I feel as though there's something that would be helpful for them, I find where that exists in myself and I share my own experience of that. So, whether it be like, taking certain foods out of my diet or doing a certain practice or whatever it might be, I just share my experience of it. And I don't ever say, I think you should do this, or I think this would be helpful for you. I just share, this is what has been supportive for me. And if they approach me with some curiosity, like tell me more, then I kind of engage. But, when it comes to family, one thing that's really important is people want to maintain their sense of sovereignty and free will. And anything that's a threat to that, whether you're trying to tell them, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that, or not do this, or not eat that, they see that as a breach on their sense of sovereignty and free will. And within a family, it's more threatening. So there's also the elements that I was thinking about earlier when you were sharing, is there's a couple sides of the child archetype. And the child archetype, a lot of times when you're engaging someone that, you might have something amazing to offer them, but they're totally rejecting of it. Like they don't want to take your advice. They don't want to hear it. A lot of times that's the child in us that had maybe like an overbearing mother or father that was always telling them what to do. And a lot of times anyone telling them what to do, it triggers the child archetype in them that feels controlled. So even though you might have something great to offer them, if they feel like they're being controlled, their inner rebel is going to come out. But on the other hand, there's actually the flip side of people that don't know how to make a choice for themselves. So they actually outsource it to others and ask people, hey, what should I do for this? Or what should I eat? Or what should I do this? Or should I do that? And people don't actually know how to make an empowered choice for themselves because the child archetype is afraid of the consequences of making a wrong choice. Right? So there's kind of like the two polarities of the child archetype and when you're engaging people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Dude, super powerful. And I really appreciate your, just the way that you approach answering these questions. And I can sense that you've been doing this a while. How long have you been doing this?
I've been working in this field for just under 10 years.
Okay. Well, I can tell you've taken on some clients, and I love how you keep referring back to it seems like there's distilled wisdom, a lot coming from Paul Chek, but Paul is also just pointing out seemingly timeless things that seem to come up in human behavior. So I really appreciate the way that you've drawn from that. You answered these questions really seamlessly. I want to make sure that people, because there are quite a few people that are listening, I've read some of their questions, but in the chat, I want to make sure that if any of them feel called to reach out to you, let them know how they can find you, and also what's coming up for you. What's the big vision? What do you see happening in the future that you want to build and create?
Yeah. So if, any of the listeners are interested in working with me one-on-one, they can go to my website, which is healing4d.com. That's the number 4d.com. If they want to just set up a call with me to explore some of my coaching and program offerings, they can go to healing4d.com/call. And if they're interested in enrolling in my new online program, which is called Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is a 21-day guided online program, which really takes you through a lot of the work that we're talking about today, diet and lifestyle, exploring archetypes, core addictions, things like that. They can go to healing4d.com/HTM, and they can use the code if they want to enroll at checkout, BEN20, to save 20% off. So that's healing4d.com/HTM if they want to enroll in that new online program, Healing the Minds. So it's BEN20 at checkout.
I'll put that in the description as well.
Cool.
Yeah,
YouTube description.
Thank you. And I'm glad you realized that I'm 20 years old, so I appreciate that. Dude, this has been really enlightening. I really appreciate, as soon as you mentioned Alberto Villoldo, I loved it because I've been onto his work for quite some time. Actually, when he started talking about diet, he was talking about things that were above, his time, I should say, talking about the gut microbiome and some common myths in diet. And this is Alberto Villoldo, like shaman, So anyway, I really appreciate where you've come in your practice. I'm glad you reached out to me, man. And we're going to have you back on the program and maybe
Absolutely.
have like some other very specific questions. I feel like you have a good knack for taking on very specific questions and showing that there are best practices that, at least in terms of these hangups that a lot of people and potential lessons shrouded in problem, that there are best practices. And, this isn't the first time it's happened to a human. And there are people that we can reach out to grant us a little bit more insight and also permission to move into our own healing. And if there's anything you want to comment on that before we wrap it up, let me know, because the permission thing is really important when it comes to healing.
Yeah. And, one thing that actually comes up is when it comes to healing, a lot of times we look at our problems and our issues as very complex. And a lot of times we kind of shy away from engaging ourselves because we think this is a really complex problem or a complex issue. And one of the great illusions that we have is that complex issues need complex solutions. And a lot of the work that I do and a lot of what we're talking about is, dialing in the power of simplicity, the power of really dialing in the basics. And that's why in my program, the first week is called Foundations, which is really just dialing in the diet, the sleep, the movement, the breath, all the foundational principles that we talk about. And a lot of times complex issues can have very simple solutions, but to the ego, that's actually very threatening. So we very often overlook the power of simplicity, the power of the basics. And we don't give ourselves permission to do some of that simple work because our ego has this idea of, well, it can't be that easy. It can't be that simple. So that's one thing that I would definitely share with people is don't overlook the power of simplicity, the power of the basics, and know that when it comes to a lot of the complex issues we have, a lot of times the simple stuff gets us 80, 90% of the way. And then all the other work is really just kind of like dialing in a little icing on the cake. And you might need to, work with someone like myself or any, coach one-on-one. But that's something that's really important to me. And especially with the world and the pandemic right now, I think we're always looking for complex answers. And we overlook the power of the basics, the power of simplicity. And I think with the pandemic, with COVID and everything, people aren't talking about diet and sleep and movement and breath. And just simple practices like that. We're always looking for these, new innovative, new science, new technology, and we overlook simplicity. We put the cart before the horse.
Thank you, man. That is truly profound. I couldn't agree more. I'm loving what I'm seeing in your work, man. I'm so glad you reached out to me. I can't wait to dive a lot deeper in that. And yeah, man, I hope everyone listening, go to Greg's website, really dive deeper into this work, because I also come across a lot of coaches, and for those who can really speak very simply and clearly, which you definitely have, to what we are calling these problems, but also, a lot of the times the problems are its beauty waiting to be expressed. Like, I'm thinking back, I can't remember the exact quote, but there's this: sometimes God takes things away from you just so he can give them back to you, so you understand the power of humility and gratitude. And it's super powerful, because a lot of the times I think that's how we complicate our lives, is we think we know what we are owed. We think we know what, we deserve in many ways. And in many ways we're forgetting about the basics. Like, I've never heard in any martial arts practice or anything, okay, you're done punching, you're done kicking, you've mastered it, let's move on to, jumping and flip kicks and stuff like that. You're never done with the foundational principles, never. I would invite any of the audience to really dive deep into understanding what he just said right there. Breath, food, movement, and sleep. And also, since we talked about Paul Chek, go check out his book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. It's incredibly powerful in its simplicity. So with that being said, Greg, thank you so much for joining us here today, man. This has been such a powerful hour, 15, hour 20 that we had. I really appreciate you and your time. For the audience,
Thanks,
yeah. For the audience, please dive deeper into this. We don't do this every week just so you can hear useful things and then just go on about your day. We'd love to hear your stories about how you implement what you hear on this show. And I will be happy to. If you put that in the chat, I will be happy to mention it, if that is your wish, during a podcast, because it's really empowering to hear other people and their stories, and we can get connected deeper to our story when we're hearing the story alive in somebody else. With that being said, we do this every single Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. We constantly have thought leaders on who can speak about what's happening in the world in a non-divisive, very clear and empowering way. I also do Waking Infinity News on Mondays, the deeper dives behind the paywall, benjosephstewart.com. And with that, we, Gordo and I, and people such as Greg, guests such as Greg, we do this for you. So thank you. Please joining the chat. Please keep joining the chat, putting down your thoughts, allowing us to become better at what we do through your feedback. And with that being said, I honor, I appreciate, I love every single one of you, and I'll check you all next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.